Thank you for joining me on my serialized podcast, 9 Lives. It's a collection of true stories about my life adventures, risk-taking, and near-death experiences. 9 Lives covers a timeline of 40 years, from 1960 up to the year 2000. I invite you to join me in this series of true and incredible accounts of thrilling adventures and more than a few occasions when it all might have ended for me. Welcome to Episode 8, Mayhem in Moscow, an account of what could have been a deadly incident in the late 1990s. I'd had relationships with folks in Russia since the late 1960s, largely engaged on infrastructure projects. Over that 30-year period, I'd seen significant changes, from the days of the secret Soviet Union to its demise and the fall of the Soviet Union, to a country bustling with economic opportunity in the newfound friendship between Russia and the West, particularly with American companies willing to engage in helping Russia climb out of the dark days of the Soviet Union to cooperate across many industries, particularly the high-tech sector. It was indeed a different Russia that I'd known in the late 1960s as part of a government-sponsored trade group between the UK and Russia. The trade group that I belonged to was largely technological, focusing in areas such as telecommunications, transportation, including airlines, and the hospitality industry, each of which was in pretty bad shape under Soviet management. The meetings were held alternatively in London and in Moscow. The relationship between the groups was very friendly. However, there was a great disparity in what the Russians experienced in London and what we experienced in Moscow. I remember on my first trip, arrangements for transportation and accommodation in Russia were organized by Intourist, a state-run organization. I was met at the airport by an interpreter, who was obviously more than just an interpreter, and driven to Moscow in one of the agency's fleet of cars. I was told that our destination would be a newly built modern hotel. But when we arrived at the site, there was no hotel. The very pleasant lady interpreter showed me a brochure of the hotel, and sure, it looked like a hotel and it looked very modern. The problem was, there was no hotel. My charming interpreter said, "No, this will get fixed. We will go to the Intourist office," where, after about an hour or two, it was determined that there were no hotel rooms available in Moscow, but that I was welcome to stay at one of the agency's apartments until a hotel room became available. We then proceeded to a very nice apartment block and to a very nicely furnished modern apartment, which, to my surprise, turned out to be my interpreter's apartment. She politely said I could stay there as long as needed, and she would move to her sister's apartment just a few blocks away. That, of course, was much different than the experience that the Russians would get when they came to London, where they stayed in some of the nicest hotels, which our guests very much appreciated, and they tried their best to reciprocate when we were in Moscow. The relationship between the two government groups was friendly, courteous, and professional, and regardless of the disparity in travel arrangements, we achieved a great deal. Over the next 20 years, things would improve dramatically, even though it was still under Soviet control. When in Moscow, I was never concerned about my safety. There was little or no crime, at least not that was known about. Over the weekend, we'd take walks in Gorky Park and visit one of the city's most favorite restaurants that regularly provided entertainment by some of Russia's great musicians. It was part of an in-tourist hotel, where the occupancy was pretty well 100% foreigners, coming from all over Europe. What was not known to me at the time, but I found out much later, the top floor of the hotel was filled with KGB operatives. And you can guess what they were doing, listening in to every telephone call made by the guests of the hotel. Fast forward down to the 90s, and just prior to the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. During the previous 10 years, American businesses had engaged with Russian counterparts, largely on infrastructure projects, providing technology and solutions aiming to bring the living standards of Russians closer to those experienced by Western Europe and the United States. This relatively rapid change brought new problems for the citizenry in the way of increased crime. It did become less safe to move around in Moscow, and people that I'd known for many years expressed concern about moving around in Moscow, and the wealthiest were employing private security guards. I was advised by a friend that I'd known for many years in Moscow that I should not take an ordinary cab, and when needed they would provide a car driven by a security guard from the company. I took his advice and never had a problem moving around Moscow from that point forward. The driver and security guard was a huge guy. I don't think anyone would have taken him on. The 1990s were the heydays of the Russian gangsters, and from the time when crime was rarely reported, it was now all over the newspapers, on radio and television. It had now become more like the days of Al Capone in Chicago, with mob wars springing up all over Russia, particularly in the big cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow. And I came a little too close to one of them. That was in 1996, and I'll talk about that in a bit. However, in just a few years, all that died down, following the election of Vladimir Putin as president of the Russian Federation, who had led the KGB for a number of years. Under Putin's management, the mob wars ended, the economy settled down, and Western companies flooded into Russia. Moscow soon became like any other European capital, filled with high-end stores, malls, restaurants, and even Starbucks and McDonald's. The McDonald's that we used to frequent was definitely upscale, much more like those you find in London. Moscow had certainly changed from the days when I first visited and had to stay in one of the state's apartments because there were not enough hotel rooms in the city. Things had changed a lot. New modern hotels had been built, and others had been refurbished to modern standards, including the one that I used to stay at regularly, the Slavyanska Hotel, which became the Radisson Slavyanska Hotel. It was the brainchild of an ambitious Oklahoman and former Southern California businessman who saw the newly capitalistic Russia as an entrepreneur's heaven, and the Radisson as his personal stake in it. The guy's name was Paul Tatum. He modernized the Slavyanska Hotel in central Moscow into one of the first Western-style hotels in the city. His partners in the venture were, however, less than scrupulous. They were previously part of the Chechen mafia and a Russian business culture that doesn't play fair. Tatum apparently knew that playing with these individuals was a little dangerous. He knew that murder was a corporate strategy in Moscow. He also knew that 200 Russian business executives had been killed in mafia-style hits in the city in the last year. But he gambled they would never dare kill a prominent American, and he even stopped wearing a bulletproof vest. That would be his demise. It cost him his life. Someone that I met at the hotel said, who knew him very well, that he forgot where he lived, and would go about his business like he would in the States or any other civilized country, and forgot that he was in Moscow, where mafia-style hits had become commonplace in the city. In late 1996, I'd been invited back to Moscow to discuss a project that would provide a television news service similar to CNN, serving the 5 time zones that spread across Russia. Together with a technical expert from Europe, we arrived on the last week of October and started discussions, and we'd completed them by the weekend and decided that we'd fly home on the Saturday. However, some last-minute changes required that we stay over the weekend, and with true Russian hospitality, we were entertained at one of the finest restaurants in Moscow on Saturday evening, followed by a suggestion that we join the group on Sunday morning for fish breakfast out at a lake about 30 miles from Moscow, just like a good backyard cookout in the United States, with fish caught fresh from the lake. Promptly at 9:30 on Sunday the 3rd of November, a car arrived driven by our trusty bodyguard, who we affectionately called Boris Badenov. that antagonistic character in the Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoon show. For saying he worked with the KGB in his past, he was a jolly guy, and he liked our company. Our meeting point at the lake was off the main highway that connects Moscow with St. Petersburg. The 30-mile journey took less than 30 minutes. Boris, of course, ignoring all speed limits. We arrived around 10 o'clock, and the party was already in full swing, with several bottles of vodka already being destroyed. There were a number of barbecue pits, and when we arrived, they welcomed us in great spirits. What we didn't expect is that if we wanted fish for breakfast, we were going to have to catch our own, and we were promptly given fishing poles. And much to my surprise, we caught a couple of really good ones. It was indeed a great experience fishing for breakfast, being surrounded by jovial Russians whose main aim in life that Sunday was to enjoy it to the max. It was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon when we set off back to Moscow, barreling down the highway at breakneck speed, with my colleague declaring quietly that he'd never drive with Boris again unless it was in a speed-controlled environment in Moscow. Nonetheless, we arrived safely, when Boris, never did find out what his real name was, said, "I'll pick you up around 7 and take you to meet the guys at another restaurant close to Gorky Park." My colleague and I arranged to meet in the lobby around 6 o'clock to go over what we needed to do on Monday and then be able to leave by Tuesday. Around 6:45, I said to my colleague, "I'll look out for Boris." I would regularly stand out on the pavement when he arrived so that he could go park the car if we had to wait for my colleague or we got delayed for some reason. There was a small crowd gathered in the lobby and between the glass doors that separated the lobby from the main entrance. I went outside and stood along a couple of other people that were waiting for their rides, when I suddenly realized I didn't have my pass on me, and also needed to get some rubles from the cash machine in the lobby. It would only take me 5 minutes or so to go back to the room and get what I needed and be back in time to meet Boris. Returning a few minutes later to the lobby, there was mayhem, with my colleague standing there frozen, looking at me, saying, "There's just been a drive-by shooting right outside the hotel, and I thought it might have been you, because you would have been standing in that same spot waiting for our ride to arrive." The police were quick to arrive. From what we could gather from Boris interpreting what had gone on, it was a scare tactic of the Chechen mafia on behalf of Paul Tatum's unscrupulous partners to have him relinquish his share in the hotel. The point was, he'd already left the hotel, having received a call from someone to meet him in the subway close to the hotel, which, together with his 2 bodyguards, is where he was killed. We read in the English-language newspaper the following day that Paul Tatum had been killed in the subway by an unidentified assailant who'd followed him down the subway steps. And as though nothing had happened, the hotel continued to operate as though nothing had happened to Paul Tatum. His body was never returned to the United States, and it was interred in the Kuntsevo Cemetery in Moscow. Thanks for joining me on Episode 8 of 9 Lives, Mayhem in Moscow. Please join me for the final chapter, Episode 9, The End of the Road. It will be available on September the 13th.